You've just watched the powerful documentary Fullerton. Even though it's over 15 years ago, all of the issues in this documentary remain pertinent today, and our panel will discuss these next. I just want to say that I personally knew Eddie Fullerton. It was my absolute privilege to have known him. And today, anybody who knew him in Donegal, regardless of their politics, speak with love and affection about this man of the people. So our discussion today is to get to the truth of why this man of the people was taken away from us. Before I introduce the panel, I want to pay particular tribute to Eddie Fullerton's family. They were failed by the authorities on both sides of the border over the years. And the Fullerton documentary is a testament to their tireless efforts to get to the truth. All of the revelations in that documentary are due to their efforts working with human rights activists and campaigners. And I'm sure that you'll join me in giving your full support in their ongoing fight for justice and for truth. I'm now going to introduce the panel for today. So our panel moderator is Paul O'Connor, and Paul is director of the Pat Finucane Centre in Derry. He's been a human rights campaigner for many, many years, and he's worked closely with the Eddie Fullerton family throughout their justice campaign. Next is Donal O'Mailfoyle, who is the director and the producer of that documentary, and I'm sure you'll agree, did an absolutely tremendous job and continues to support and work with the family up to today. Next, we'll have the renowned journalist and author, Anne Cadwallader, and of course, any of you who have any interest in human rights in Ireland will know of her campaigning and her courage over the years in helping families to get to the truth. Next is Amanda Fullerton, daughter of Eddie. She had the daunting challenge of taking over from her beloved brother, Albert, when we lost him to a road traffic tragedy many years ago. And she's done Albert and her father proud in continuing the campaign for years. And then finally, we have Kevin Winters, renowned lawyer and the representative for the Fullerton family. I'm now going to hand over to Paul O'Connor, who's going to moderate the panel today.
Pádraig, many thanks for the introduction, and I think we'd all agree with your description of the courage and the tenacity of the Fullerton family, and it's been our privilege to work with the family over many, many years. So our audience has just seen the documentary again, Fullerton, and I mean, I'm struck by the fact that this was made 15 years ago, Donal, and I'm sure the atmosphere at that stage for making a documentary about collusion, indeed cross-border collusion, was a very different attitude even to today. And I would be interested to hear from you what some of the difficulties were, what the environment was like, even to get it screened at that point in time, because it was a very critical documentary and critical of the Gardaí and the authorities in the Republic. Maybe you could share some of that with us. You're muted, Donal.
Well, there were other documentaries made on the Fullerton programme before our programme went out. ITV and I think it was Granada had a programme as well that covered some aspects of the Fullerton documentary. But you are correct, Paul, in saying in the South, while there were some journalists, the likes of Anne Cadwallader, doing, writing about collusion, RT itself wasn't really covering the subject in much detail. There were one or two examples, but in general, that was the case. And I suppose what happened in my case was, while doing a master's in journalism, did some research into the role of British intelligence activity in the south of Ireland. And it was that how I came across the Fullerton murder case the first time. And the thing that struck me was only 3 times in the history of the state has there been a murder of an elected representative. You have Kevin Higgins in 1927, you have Senator Billy Fox in 74, and then you had Eddie Fullerton in 1991. And when I examined the papers around 1991, I realized it got so little coverage. This was the killing of an elected representative, and yet it was getting so little coverage. I think I mentioned in the documentary, Mahi was the only person who could mention it at the time in Dáil to condemn the murder. And so I then, after I did my finish my master, thought, okay, this might make a good idea for a documentary. And I should mention here that at the same time, one of the finest journalists in Ireland, Frank Connolly, was also writing the odd piece about the Fullerton murder. So I met up with Frank, and together we had a chat about could we put this documentary on air as such. And I was early enough in my career making programs. I had done a few programs with TG Cahir at that point. And I approached TG Cahir, and I remember being a little bit apprehensive, thinking, how will they accept this? But fortunately, very fortunately, the commissioning editor at the time, Donegal man, Micheál O'Malley, had also a different view of how things should be done. He wasn't saying, I'm going to do it exactly the way it's been done for years. And he, as I say, gave us the chance, and we went ahead with the documentary. Now, when we started that documentary, I have to say, we're also very fortunate in the fact that we didn't have half the information that we ended up having at the end of the program. And it took a risk on the commissioner editor's part to actually give it right in the limb to give us the money to make that documentary. I suppose the greatest challenges we had when we were making the documentary was what was going to be the story here, because it's okay, you expect to say who killed them, why killed them, but we realized we weren't going to get detailed information. But when we sat down with the solicitor at the time, Greg O'Neill, the story that became emerged very quickly was the poor, shabby nature of the Garda investigation at the time. Poor forensics, poor investigation gathering, poor, I think, notebooks going missing, that sort of thing. So, of course, our broadcaster got very nervous and we said we're going to start pointing fingers at poor Garda investigation. But again, fortune was in our favour, because around the same time the Morris Tribunal came out, and there was issues which looked at issues of inappropriate behaviour of Gardaí in Donegal at the time. So that allowed us then, I suppose, to look at more the Garda side of things. The thing that struck me, I suppose, when I started to look into this, to Fullerton murder, it followed the pattern of so many murders involving collusion that the poor Garda investigation followed. Whether you're talking about Seamus Ludlow, talking about Christopher Phelan, Monaghan Donning, you name them, it's the same. And when I sat down then with some former security personnel in the north, or mainly RUC people, they also began to, highlight the point that this was a very sophisticated operation and was unlikely to have been done by loyalists alone. It needed some piece of cooperation of a higher level, as a district level. Now, I think it was the committee, Commission the Film that pointed to the idea of a boat coming across the Swilly and so on, and carrying out, the loyalists came across the Swilly in the boat and carried out the murder in that way. But when we were making the documentary, now I think it was quite late in the process, this key witness came forward, who we mentioned in the documentary, who stated that he saw a number of men getting into what looked like an unmarked car, and subsequently after that, that this key witness was interviewed in the back of a car by a senior Garda and a senior RUC man. And this put a different complexion on things when that information came out, because the key point about this was that it didn't seem that this information that this witness had come forward at the time was pursued by either the Gardaí or the RUC. Now, the thing about making a documentary is you're limited by a certain time frame. So I think it was only maybe weeks after our documentary went out that more information started coming forward. And if I understand correctly, I think it was after the documentary that Amanda went to the police ombudsman, or the Fullerton family, I should say, that Amanda went to the police ombudsman Northern Ireland to carry out another report. And of course, you have the Minister for Justice in the South suggesting to carry out, or instructing Gardaí to carry out a review of the investigation at the time.
Right.
And,
if I come in at that stage, because I think Amanda's going to tell us more then about what then transpired with the Ombudsman and so on. I mean, you did highlight some speculation there was at the time to do with, particularly tied into where the car was burnt out and so on, that I think we now would agree, this is from others, no longer holds the issue about the killers using a boat to cross the foil, that just doesn't add up anymore. Or the issue that it might have been members of the UDA from Lisburn and led by the so-called gravedigger who were involved. I think you would agree that that no longer stands as evidence.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that is, I mean, the exact details, there's some information still unknown, and we have to still wait. But that part is clear, that the going back, yeah, that was never the case.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we'll be coming back, I think, during the course of this conversation as we share it around. But it was obviously a very brave move of yours at the time to seek the funding and to convince TG Carr to make it. It was a game changer, I think, from the family's perspective. Before going into the detail, I think with Amanda of where the family have been and the actual family campaign, there's one aspect of this case that applies to all others at that time that I think is, I'm going to turn to my colleague in the PFC, to Anne, to talk about, which is that officially, at least, this murder was claimed by the Ulster freedom fighters. And there are today, even as we speak, still media who refer to the Ulster freedom fighters and say that the Ulster freedom fighters were responsible for a number of murders and so on. Now, of course, the documents available from the British government side make clear that the British government never believed there to be such an organisation. And I was hoping that Anne might explain the background to that.
Okay, yes, I'm very pleased to do that, Paul. First of all, I'd just like to give a health warning to everyone about the content of what I'm going to be saying will sound a bit like a conspiracy theory, and I'm no fan of conspiracy theories. What I would ask you to do, though, is to look at the evidence and to think it over and to maybe read a bit more and to see if you agree that this does fit in with a much wider story. Collusion fits into the pattern of previous British colonial wars. What we should do maybe is what you should do when you're looking at any criminal activity is to look at the record of the criminal involved, in this case, the British state. And throughout its colonial past, in cases like Palestine, Aden, and Cyprus, the British controlled the people they were governing by using special forces, special gangs, counter gangs, call them what you will, but it's something that they did throughout the empire. I will be talking a bit about Major General Sir Frank Kitson and his theories, but there are many others. In Kenya, for example, Major Kitson used what he called counter gangs. He was quite open about this, and he has written about it. In Northern Ireland, there was a different situation because instead of bribing and intimidating people to do its dirty work for it, the British state had no need to, because there was a pool of loyalists there ready and willing to do its bidding. And the policy that they ended up with was what we call maximum plausible deniability. That is, official hands remain clean, and the dirty war, the murders, are carried out by surrogate forces. Sir Frank Kitson became the most senior member of the British Army. He received every decoration that is possible for the state to give. He's still living somewhere in the west of England. And he devised this theory. It was devised before him. We can't really give him credit for it, really, but he at least wrote about it first, because it's surprising in some ways that we have found evidence of what his theory was. And he wrote about it in various books, and the UDR and the UDA would be two examples in Ireland of what we would consider to be counter gangs, the idea that he conceived when he was soldiering in Kenya. And he said in one of his books, there are innumerable ways in which the theory can be applied, and it's up to those involved to adapt them to the relevant situation. The using of intimidation and bribery to persuade people to do the dirty work of empire, he said, was not dishonorable. Now, to bring this bit back to Ireland, we know, because we found a document, which you see there on the screen, that as early as 1973, the British government was very aware that a significant proportion of the UDR, the largest regiment in the British Army at the time, were also loyalist paramilitaries. So they joined the UDR to get training, to get access to weapons and intelligence. And as you see in this document, it concludes, and this is an internal British government document, that between 5 and 15% of all members of the UDR the official regiment in the British Army, were also loyalist paramilitaries. And as loyalist paramilitaries, they would be involved in passing on of information and accessing weapons and training. Meanwhile, while they accepted that the UDA was involved in infiltrating the UDR, the British government refused to ban the UDA. It remained legal until 1992, and here are two examples of the sort of activities, intimidating activities they were involved in at the time, as well as murder, naturally. And it went as far as the British Army actually mounting joint patrols with the UDA in Belfast and elsewhere during the early days of the conflict. Now, at the time, various parts of the nationalist and Republican community were demanding that London ban the UDA, but the Catholic Church, the Irish government, the SDLP, Sinn Féin, and others were saying that the UDA should be banned. However, London refused, saying the UDA was separate from the UFF, in whose name the murders were claimed. However, at the time, they knew the reality. This document again dates back to 1976, and if you read it, you'll see that London knew at the time that the UFF didn't exist. There was only the UDA. And in this document, it tries, that is the UFF, tries to maintain, the UDA, sorry, tries to maintain a respectable front, and to this end either denies responsibility for sectarian murders or claims them in the name of the Ulster Freedom Fighters. And the Ulster Freedom Fighters, this document describes as a prescribed and essentially fictitious organization, which is widely known to be a nom de guerre of the UDA. So London knew there was one organization, and that one organization was involved in wholesale murder and intimidation. It went so far as London went so far as to say in the next document that the leader of the UDA, the supreme commander, as he called himself, of the UDA, Andy Tirry, was agreed and supported the murder of Catholics. He was regularly invited to meetings for discussions with senior British government civil servants. And in this document, you see the British are telling themselves that Tirry was not averse to killing Catholics, even those who have no Republican connections, if he thinks it necessary at any particular point in time. So it's clear from this that the British government knew exactly what they were doing. They knew the UDA were involved in murder. They knew its leader supported the murder of Catholics, but yet they still regularly invited him to meetings. This wasn't just at a low level. This went right to the top. In this document, which is dated back to September 1975, it's a meeting between the then Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, and the leader of the opposition, Margaret Thatcher. This is a note of that meeting between them, and it notes that Merlin Rees said that the UDR, the UFF and the UDR there was joint membership, and there were people who were prepared to hand over information, for example, to Mr. Paisley, and that the British Army's judgment was that the Ulster Defence Regiment, the largest regiment in the British Army, was heavily infiltrated by extremist Protestants and in a crisis situation could not be relied upon to be loyal. So I reckon that that's a pretty definitive definition of what Kitson called a counter-gang. They were operating within the structures of the state, carrying out the state's bidding, what the state wanted, but in a maximal and in a deniable way. There was maximum deniability. So they told one story to the public and another to themselves. Now, it sounds pretty grim, I agree with you, but there is hope for the future partly because of the Black Lives Matter movement, and also because of there are elements in the British population at the moment who are re-investigating and rethinking London's imperial past. One thinks of the example of the statue being tipped into the river in Bristol and elsewhere, when there are elements within Britain who are re-examining the country's imperial past. And we're happy to work with them and to encourage them, because we think that it's necessary to look back at history, not only the history of Ireland, but the history of empire in general, and to learn very important lessons from it. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, Anne. I think everybody agrees. It's absolutely fascinating, particularly because it's based on their own documents. And of course, the importance of that is, and the point we're trying to make about context is, that the people that got into a number of vehicles and drove down to Buncrana all those years ago to kill an elected representative, Amanda's father, were members of an organization that was not prescribed. And that's very, very important, I think, to bear in mind. So going to the heart of all of this, we would not be sitting here today remembering Eddie Fullerton were it not for his family and for their efforts. And at the heart of that now, over many, many years, since Albert's tragic car accident, has been Amanda. Amanda, it's been a long journey.
Yes, Paul, it has indeed. And here we are 30 years later.
Yeah. Can you share some of that with us?
Yeah, I suppose, yeah. So for my family, going back to that dreadful day prior to that dreadful day in 1991, my father was sitting with a death threat, which was of great concern because although he approached the Gardaí for some sort of protection, that was never forthcoming. So the murder happened in 1991, and from the outset, we were stunned that the Gardaí weren't interested in taking statements from appropriate people, and really were more concerned about interviewing the family about our relationship with our father. And we made several complaints at the time. You know, you need to make appropriate investigation. You need to be more thorough with the statement trail. In our community, there were all sorts of rumours running about. Some are credible, some weren't, but they had to be pursued. So key people from the outset were never questioned. Then rolling forward to, we were a grieving family in 1991. We hadn't got a clue. We didn't know what an inquest meant. We thought, a doctor presented and talked about, the nature of the wounds that were inflicted and the nature of the death. But we had no idea that an inquest meant an investigation into the crime by the authorities, that, you were meant to look at evidence, lines of inquiry, that you could bring a solicitor. So we got a call. The inquest was held on December 19th, 1991. And we got a call 4 days from the Gardaí to say, be in Carndonna on the 19th of December. There's an inquest. We hadn't a clue. What we now know is that was definitely not a appropriate inquest. Mm-hmm. And we now know that forensic intelligence had come to the attention of the Gardaí that were just not brought to the inquest, nor any line of forensic information or lines of inquiry. Now, there's a lot to cover, so I have to really jump on now from there to 2003. In that intervening period, my family, our only route to an investigation and communication at the time was through the Gardaí Síochána. We were told quite clearly, although the murder was perpetrated in the north of Ireland, this was a jurisdictional issue, and only the Gardaí Síochána could conduct an investigation. So we were pretty naive at the time, and we did rely on that avenue. Having said that, there were numerous over the years, and I'm jumping forward to 2003, but filling in the gaps there. Over the years, different things would start to emerge in the media, things about like a forensic link with Castle Rock, Grey Steel, different things and we would actively go to the Gardaí and ask them, can you follow up on this? Can you pursue that? It was very difficult. It was one closed door after another, and we were getting absolutely nowhere. So in 2003, we decided, we'd grieved enough. 2003, we decided to get together as a family because we were, we had a few smarts about us, and we got together and we thought, now what do we have to do here? So we established the Eddie Fullerton Justice Committee, which was comprised mostly of our family, led by Albert, and we managed to appoint Greg O'Neill as a solicitor. And Greg had a bit of a reputation at the time too for, you know, these kind of cases. And we progressed. So Albert then was active, as Donal said earlier. He managed to liaise with Donal and work with Donal. He worked on a previous documentary with Insight in UTV, and then he managed to get this documentary with Donal. And that documentary was an amazing experience for us as a family, because Donal helped us to dig in a way that we had never been able to dig into lines of inquiry, etc. And Albert's appearance on the radio, etc., you know, and awareness campaigns, you know, generated a new witness. This witness had come forward on the day of the murder, was ignored, was covered up, and he came to us again and made a statement to our legal representative. And so that Albert also, it was Albert actually that made the complaint to the PONI, Police Ombudsman for Northern Ireland, in 2003. That complaint, 2003 or 2004, that complaint was about could the Police Ombudsman look into the activity of the RUC at the time, and then the PSNI, could he look into their activity concerning the murder investigation? We were concerned about digging up some information. What information was passed to the Gardaí that the Gardaí never responded to, and things like that. So that got underway, and then Michael McDowell announced, sanctioned the reinvestigation at the same time. So those two were running in parallel. In 2006, it was one of the pivotal years. Albert obviously was tragically killed, and as we were switching, and Padraig, you were there when we did this, when we switched off his machine, I was approached and I was told, well, you have to take over now. We've decided it's you. So I had no choice, and here we are. So I took over the investigation, and later that year, it was a pivotal year in 2006, we were presented with the reinvestigation report from Chief Superintendent Noel White. We immediately rejected it. It was not a comprehensive investigation. It was really, as I was told recently, 23 questions we posed and 23 questions we responded to. And we rejected it. We were really hoping for a concerted effort to actually get to the bottom of the activity of the Gardaí around the time of the murder and subsequent to that. So we met then with Bertie Ahern to complain. He listened to us and appointed Assistant Commissioner Donnellan. And his role was to look into the role of the Gardaí, activity in relation to the murder, you know, the extent to which they investigated on our behalf. Needless to say, that never really was forthcoming. In 2006, the Ombudsman told me their investigation was going to commence, and it did. So we're going to jump forward now then to 2013, which is another pivotal year. So in between times, it was constantly going up and down the road to Dublin to meet with Noel White and Donnellan, but nothing really ever forthcoming. It really was a case of their attitude was show us the evidence. What do you know? You know, never really coming back to us with anything new. It was always following us on things we were probing. So coming forward then to 2013, the PONI, and during this time as well, we were meeting continuously with the PONI team of investigators and getting feedback on lines of inquiry that they were uncovering. And all along, they were not getting any cooperation from An Garda Síochána in the south. So we were presented with that report in 2013 after a series of delays, and that report, we were asked not to reveal the findings of that report, but that report led to a wider investigation of a series of linked murders during the late 80s and 90s, and that involved state agents and their handlers. That report has been ongoing.
So Amanda, just to be clear for the audience again, because we're kind of familiar with the material. So there was an original police ombudsman investigation into your father's murder. And then the police ombudsman said to you, and we were there at the time, that they wanted to extend that into a much larger investigation into a series of other murders in the north by the same, they believe, the same approximate gang within the UDA.
Yeah, that's correct. And it was definitely the UDA. I think one of the things that came out of the actual report into my father's murder, the first report, Operation Medina, was the Ombudsman categorically stated that his investigation had been hindered by the lack of by no cooperation from An Garda Síochána, amongst other things. So that second investigation commenced in 2013, and we are awaiting that report. We know that it's concluded, and we met with the police ombudsman just yesterday, and she has assured us that this report will be published in this autumn.
Yeah, I think one piece of information that's might be interesting again for the audience is, and it's in the public domain, is that one of the key reasons the report has been delayed for so long, and in fact, indeed, all reports have been delayed for so long, is because of a challenge by the Retired Police Officers Association, which effectively hindered the work of the main statutory body in the North, whose job it is to investigate the police, and that delayed it over several years, and that really is quite shocking. So the situation is at the moment, I'm going to turn to Kevin in a minute, but the situation at the moment, Amanda, is that the family are expecting that report later this year.
Yeah, this autumn, and we really are awaiting it. There's a lot of relevant information apparently in this report.
Yeah.
So where we are now is we've made great headway. During this time, I didn't mention that Kevin Winter and Kevin Winter's legal office came on, KR Law came, and Kevin Winters came on board to support our campaign. And Kevin's based in Belfast. And we are now in the position that my mother's instigated legal proceedings against the Chief Constable of the CSNI, the Northern Ireland Office, and the Ministry of Defence. That is now underway, early stages, but underway. We had our first meeting since 2009 with the An Garda Síochána just a few weeks ago to get an update on where they are with the case. And and as I said, we had the pony meeting. So that's where we are right now.
Okay. Thanks for that, Amanda. Kevin, so would you give us an update on where we are legally? There's quite a lot's happened, and there's a lot happening even this year and in the past few weeks. But from a legal perspective, where are things at?
Yeah, there's quite a bit happening on various legal fronts. Just as a preliminary, could I just say what an absolute privilege it is for us as a law firm to be representing the Fullerton family in their fight for justice, and also to Albert, and indeed I have to say too, of course, to the PFC. Without that insane work ethic that you put into everything, our job would be so much more difficult. And finally, if I could just say as well, just a passing comment to Greg O'Neill, who did sterling work back in the day. So there's a collective effort, a work product there that has helped make our job just that wee bit more smooth, if that's the right way to put it. But a starting point is the police ombudsman and the pending report. That's kind of at the centre of all the other various legal initiatives up until this point, and then going forward. There's one caveat. I'll just pick up on something you said there, Paul, about the delay to date caused by the Loughlin Island report and the retired officers' legal challenge, and that's quite right. That is the main reason. There are other reasons as well, of course, which is the funding resources problem and issues in relation to intelligence and passing of intelligence from PSNI to the Ombudsman's office, and that was particularly highlighted in the Ormer Road Bookmakers massacre. That civil action gave rise to various concerns, and the police ombudsman had expressed concern that, in fact, material that was made available to us on foot of civil proceedings, which is the same case that the Fullerton family have taken, and I'll touch on that in a minute. But when we engaged with the Ombudsman in that case, in fact, it transpired that the Ombudsman hadn't received the very same material, or some of the material that we had received on foot of civil proceedings. So that caused a serious concern in terms of accountability and transfer of information. So that's the sort of terrain that we're in terms of the civil case, which was initiated earlier this year for the family. And I suppose the context and background to that is taking a civil case is really, in some ways, an exercise in trying to fill the Article 2 investigation gap, which exists, Article 2 being the right to life and the state's obligation on the investigation and taking of life, which, of course, in this case, like so many hundreds of other cases during the conflict involving cases of collusion, is seriously, chronically underused. And in this case here, in the Fullerton case, we know, of course, that there has been no meaningful investigation on either side of the border. But in terms of the north of Ireland and in terms of the Article 2 issue, the civil action represents something of an attempt to access information and documents. And we are hoping to do that by way of a discovery application. And we will get into the same terrain that we have found in the Lough Island case, the Omer Road Bookmakers case, as I've highlighted. But it's not easy. It takes an awful lot of time. The Ombudsman's findings will help contribute to that. We can't put the case together alleging all the strands of collusion in the Fullerton case until we get our hands on that Ombudsman's report. There's one other caveat to that, and that we hope that after the handing over of that report by the Ombudsman, the draft report to the PSNI, that there's no attempt at a rollback or any effort made on their part to try and stop publication, in which case that leads to another legal battle of the type that we've seen in the past. The other significant impact of the Ombudsman's report is its relevance to what's happening in the south of Ireland in terms of the Irish state and the Gardaí. And we hope that the findings of the report will contribute and inform our engagement with the Gardaí and the state, the Irish state. We hope that it will facilitate agitation with the Guards to present a file finally to the DPP, which could in turn effect a request for warrants for arrest of those suspects who are known to everyone on both sides of the border. But the other significant impact of that will be our ability to then make a formal application to the Attorney General for a new inquest into the killing of Eddie Fullerton. The inquest, such as it was back in the day in December 1991, was completely and utterly ineffectual. And as Amanda has highlighted, it was just nothing short of appalling the way the family were treated. There was no inquest at all. We feel that the circumstances are now rife for a formal application to the Attorney General. And in terms of the background and the context for that application, we have seen that there's been very, very little engagement on that issue in the past with the Irish state. This is not just a matter of the Gardaí feeling, it's the Irish state feeling the Fullerton family. So I'd be very keen to stress the fact that this is a state failing to date, and it's systemic and it's ongoing. So our request to the Attorney General for a new inquest, we suspect it will be met with some degree of resistance. We have a legal test case pending at the minute, which will actually help inform what's happening with the Fullerton family. And in fact, at the first application before the court, the judge had expressed some sort of degree of incredulity, had never really encountered Article 2 before. And that sets the scene for what lies ahead, and we expect and anticipate many, many legal battles. There's one observation I want to make on it, and that is in terms of the background to other cases, and it's been highlighted as well by Donald, the Dublin Monaghan bombings, for example. At least in that case, there was the Barron report, the Barron inquiry. So the families there had something approximating to some degree of state investigation. The Fullerton family had nothing, absolutely nothing to date. And so this will represent a first attempt to try and get some, if you like, judicial intervention on what has been an Article 2 investigative wasteland down south. So there are many, many challenges ahead in that. There are other parallels as well, of course. Not only did you see in Dublin Monaghan the obvious collusion allegations with the British state and its various agencies using loyalists as proxies to fight a wider political security war. We also have seen in Dublin Monaghan, regrettably, serious Garda inefficiency and state reticence to actually investigate. That is replicated here as well. In the case of Dublin Monaghan, it's been said that it's an example, a horrible example of one country bombing another country. In the case of Eddie Fullerton, it's a horrible example of one country facilitating the murder of a political agitator in another country. That's what happened here. And it's appalling, and it involves, if you like, a three-dimensional legal engagement in both sides of the border in terms of the civil action in the north, the request for the Attorney General to have a new inquest, and agitation in relation to the Guards to actually investigate, which is long, long overdue. So
Okay.
that's my preliminary views on the legal issues as they stand.
Yeah. Yeah, apologies that it's had to be compressed so much, and we are running out of time. I think we have about 3 minutes left, and before signing off, I wanted to give the last word to Amanda. I think today's been fascinating, the journey that people have gone through, and as in so many of these cases, part of it was led by a groundbreaking documentary many years ago. We also saw that with Dublin Monaghan and Glenanne and many other cases. I'm also struck by the fact in the documentary that this issue that there was no political reaction to Eddie Fullerton's murder at the time, and it might be something that Pádraig might raise in the Dáil even now, that the only reaction at the time was from one political leader, which is absolutely shameful. On a slightly broader issue, I'm also keenly aware that there's a lot of discussion at the moment. There is, even this week in the media, north and south, about the issue of legacy, and some people intervene in that discussion and talk about lawfare and cast aspersions on members of the legal profession that are involved in it. And it's very clear that the Fullerton family, any information they have got or are going to get, is because they are forcing the issue through the courts. They're taking JRs, they're seeking a new inquest, and seeking investigations. And that the state does not voluntarily pass over information to families in the way that you would expect in a normal democratic state. So I think that issue is worth bearing in mind, that it is very important for families to have the lawyers on board. There's also talk about lawyers being ambulance chasers and how much money they make from it and such. Our staff sat in court recently in Belfast in a case involving the two paras who killed Joe McCann. And there was only one lawyer in that court who was not being paid, and that was a lawyer from KRW, because you don't get legal aid to support a family in a prosecution. And I think those points should be made publicly, that there are firms like KRW and Paddy Murray and Madden Finucane and many others, Phoenix Law and so on, who are supporting families and quite often are not getting any legal aid for that. I said I wanted to give the last word, and it's literally because there's about a minute left, to Amanda. And before doing, to thank everybody who took part, and the context that Anne gave to us as well in terms of the whole issue of the UDA, UFF, and the colonial precedents. Amanda, you're muted.
I suppose my last word is this, and it was my oldest brother Johnny that said it to me at the weekend when my two brothers and I were talking. He said, well, no matter what comes out of it, at least as a family, we know we did our best.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody, and good night. Good night.